Hello and welcome back to 15-Minute English Lessons with me, your 15-minute English teacher. This is the channel where we try and teach you some stuff about English in 15 minutes. And because it's only 15 minutes, we are starting today with the second half of a presentation on An Inspector Calls by socialist wunderkind J.B. Priestley. Now, you still need to know how to spell his name. That's really important. So just have another look at it. Just be double checky sure about it. Examiners will be glad. Believe me, I've sat there with 500 exam papers in front of me ready to mark, and every one that spelt Priestley wrong, which was considerably a high percentage of them, made me die a little bit inside. But then when somebody spelled it right, I was automatically in a good mood with that student, and that is never a bad position to be in, because in your exams you are going to need the benefit of the doubt at some point, so you may as well do everything that you can do right to get yourself there. All right, today we are talking about characters, who they are and what they mean to J.B. Priestley, why he's included them, and what we want to talk about specifically is the impact that they have on the audience and how he's designed the characters for that. Now, this is an overview of all the kind of central characters, really. And what it doesn't do is go into massive detail about each one. However, I'm a massive nerd and I love this play. So if you do want to hear lots and lots of stuff about individual characters, and they're, like I said in the last video, the entrances, the exits, all the things that make them who they are, then we can definitely do that. Just let us know in a comment or in a message or in some other way. Carrier pigeon allowed, or you could send a possibly not real ghostly inspector figure who is the voice of the author to tell me what I should be doing with this channel. So up to you, really. Let's leave that with in your capable hands. We're starting with Mr. and Mrs. Burling. All right, so mentioned this a little bit towards the end of the last video, and Priestley needs us to hate them by the end of the play. It's important to distinguish here. We're meant to dislike them from the outset, but by the end of the play, he needs us to despise them. And they are the older generation, for whatever that means. And as you know, probably from dealings with your own parents and perhaps your grandparents and teachers and older people, they are a little stuck in their ways. They believe in the things they believe in. They're not necessarily receptive to change, and they have that kind of attitude of, well, it was all right when I was a child, and if I made it, then somebody else should be able to make it. And it's a kind of very entrenched mindset, I think, and we see it quite early on. And we talked a little bit about how Mr. Burling's use of the Titanic and the First World War as an example of how clever he is and how knowledgeable. Basically, what's happened is they've got complacent and they've got lazy and they've got cruel. Whether that's whatever reasons they have, I mean, they're not real characters, so I have to be careful talking about them. But fundamentally, we start out finding them unlikable, and then by the end of the play, we have to despise them. Therefore, their character arcs are structured to achieve that goal. Mr. Burling starts out as a fool, and not a charming one at that. The Titanic comments, the various other things. There's lots of examples of things he says early on in the play. And Mrs. Burling starts as a snob. She might not be any worse than that at the time, but, snobbery is difficult to love at the best of times, as you may know. Her comment that Sheila will kind of have to get used to the fact that her husband will be away a lot demonstrates this idea of her detachment from reality and her lack of individual initiative. And that's important later on. She doesn't really have a grasp on the reality of the world she's living in. Her little bubble, maybe, but not the whole world that surrounds her. Interestingly, Sheila instantly responds when she says this by saying, well, I don't believe I will, which sets her character up for the audience too, but more on her later on. By the end of the play, though, whatever, Mr. and Mrs. Burling aren't just dislikable. He's shown himself to be pig-headed, unapologetic, arrogant, greedy, and she's behaved in an almost inhumane manner and really shown basically no remorse. The pride, the arrogance, the refusal to apologise that she demonstrates. This is Priestley saying to us all that people like this are not to be trusted, are not to be admired, are not to be respected. Not for a socialist, for somebody with socialist politics. Priestley can't even allow them a glimmer of redemption if he's going to achieve his goal. And so it proves they don't get any redemption. There's no kind of light at the end of their tunnel. They don't seem to learn anything. There are moments of course, for both of them, where they seem to, especially while the inspector is there, but it's the two of them who are very quick to dismiss everything that's happened as soon as they find out that they are effectively off the hook. And that's an important thing as part of Priestley's politics to take away from the play. Okay, Gerald Croft, who is a tough cookie, and as a result of that, often comes up on exam questions, although, you know, any of them could, and you need to know them all, because of course they all interlink with each other so much. Gerald's often referred to as being somewhere between the younger and the older generations. It's hard to tell exactly what Priestley wanted us to think of him. On one hand, he's clearly affected by Eva's death, and he clearly feels sorry for what he's done. On the other hand, it's him that leaves and investigates Inspector Gould. He doesn't do this to try and help anyone except himself and the new in-laws. He displays equal amounts of snobbery, complacency, thoughtfulness, and consideration. So he's difficult to pigeonhole. Now, this is very much just my opinion, but in my opinion, Priestley is reaching out to men in his position in the audience. They're still young enough to make a difference, and they are the ones who are going to be running the companies who employ people like Eva. Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling are done. They're no longer relevant. They are on the way out, if you like. Gerald is not. He's if anything, he's an up-and-coming leader of a company like that. Perhaps he shows these two sides of Gerald's character so that the men in the audience have a choice. And of course, when we see behaviour reflected back to us, it's very easy to see why people find certain things distasteful and unpleasant, and find other things, you know, much more appealing and likeable. So perhaps the men in the audience have a choice. Bear in mind, though, that only one choice will ensure he gets the girl at the end. And of course, we all admire and like Sheila immensely, so the choice becomes easy. You have to be more like the version of himself that we all agree is the better side of Gerald. He's not necessarily destined to get the girl at the end of this play, but the point still stands, I think, that there is no success to be had in trying to find a way out of accountability. There's no success to be had there. The success is to be facing up to your responsibilities and doing the right thing, which is, you know, regardless of your politics, I think it's a pretty good life lesson there. Eric Burling, can we forgive him? I don't know what the answer to this is. You'll have to decide for yourself. I can tell you what I've noticed in the years that I've taught this play, but again, it's very much up to the reader. Eric is, like his father, something of an idiot, but unlike his father, the stupid decisions he makes are excusable to some degree at least. He's very young, and he's clearly been brought up by two horrendous parents who obviously prefer Gerald as a son to him. He's had no guidance whatsoever, and unlike Sheila, he doesn't even get any from the inspector, really, because he's largely absent in the first two acts of the play, which sets up a brilliant entrance when it's revealed that Eva was pregnant with his child, and he suddenly appears back on stage. But it does mean that he doesn't get the kind of lectures and questioning that Sheila is available for, because Priestley doesn't want him on stage, because that's important for his point. His behaviour towards Eva, I don't know if we can say it's excused by his drinking, but perhaps you can say it's explained by it. By the end of the play, his eagerness to change his life and his clear remorse for his actions also put us squarely on his side, and he is willing to seek guidance and support from his sister, which demonstrates his increasing maturity, and he's very open with the inspector, which also endears us to him, to the point that most audiences seem relatively willing to overlook the heavy implication that he forces himself sexually onto Eva against her wishes. Now, this is very problematic, obviously, by today's standards, where these discussions are had much more openly. And although it's still a massive problem, of course, I don't think this part of the play would be in there if the author of the play was hoping that we would forgive Eric. And I don't want to sound like one of those old people who says, well, it was a different time, so it was all right. I don't believe that for a second. It was a different time, but that certainly doesn't make it all right. However, in my experience of teaching the play, Eric is very open about what he's done, and he's very, very filled with remorse. I don't know if it's excusable or forgivable or not, but certainly, at the very least, he clearly changes, he clearly grows up a little, he's clearly willing to take responsibility and do whatever he can to make things right. and the rest of it is up to you to decide. Inspector Ghoul. Okay, he's been written about in great detail elsewhere, but the headline facts are that whether or not he is real, and of course he's equally real and not real. We see him on stage, the characters interact with him, but it's a play, so none of it's real anyway. But he is clearly the voice of the author. There's no two ways about it. He is right. Priestley cannot afford for there to be any doubt in the minds of the audience that the inspector's views are the right ones, and by extension, his own views. Therefore, Inspector Ghoul is massively intelligent, imposing, authoritative, knowledgeable, articulate, fair, and considerate. Some people say he's the voice of God or the character's consciences, maybe, but at his core, I think he's the chance to speak to the upper classes the way Priestley always wanted to. He is completely unimpressed and unmoved by Mr. and Mrs. Burling. He shows them absolutely no sympathy and really very little respect beyond common courtesy. He's unthreatened by Mr. Burling's veiled threats about his friendship with the police chief, and he's not bothered by Mrs. Burling's wrath. Conversely, he is kind and encouraging to Sheila for the most part, though he also cruelly reminds her that it's too late for her to help Eva. But we remain impressed by this because of the change it affects in Sheila. So I think there's no doubt that he is the voice of Priestley. This is Priestley's vehicle on stage so that we can all hear what he thinks. And that's why he gets these speeches, especially his last speech, which of course is the most famous one. But really, all the way through the play, he never really deviates from the central point, which is the same as Priestley's socialist politics, that we are members of one body. And really, all of the things that were done to Eva, be they relatively small or much larger in terms of their impact, were not only avoidable, but clearly avoidable. And it wouldn't necessarily have been straying outside the realms of common sense, or certainly being reasonable, to allow her to have had a different experience. And that's the point, right? The audience are going to be addressed directly by this character, and we have to believe that he's right. But yeah, one of the things that I think puts him on the audience's side is the change that we see in Sheila because of him. Speaking of Sheila, everything about her character is specifically geared towards the audience leaving the theatre, seeing her as the hero, the role model, the ideal, if you like, to which they should all aspire. There's plenty of debate about whether or not this is a feminist play, and you'll have to wait for either another video or just your own discussions for that one, because we don't really have time to get into it now. But she does represent young women in the audience, and with women's rights on the increase in the 1940s, there's no way Priestley wouldn't have known of the importance of women in society and the increasingly important role they were going to play as the future progressed. Bear in mind, after both world wars, especially the Second World War, the fact that women ran the country effectively and took on those roles that had been traditionally considered male-only roles was a huge step forward for that particular movement, and a huge step backwards for the kind of traditional views, if you like. Therefore, he's created Sheila, the perfect example to the rest of us. She begins as a likeable, if slightly stupid, silly girl. Through careful management of her entrances and exits, Priestley lets us see her grow up before our very eyes into a young woman we respect and admire. Crucially, she isn't perfect, right? She's naive, she's a bit irritating at the start of the play, like when she says, "Oh, except all last summer when you never came near me." It's often cited as the moment we see her inner intelligence, but to me, it always comes across as a kind of pathetic, poor little woman character who knows totally full well her other half is playing away, but simply chooses not to do anything about it. And of course, her behaviour towards Eva, while not criminal or violent, is unimpressively childish and petulant. But this is critical. The audience have to know that it's okay not to be perfect, but what matters is how one reacts to one's mistakes. Sheila provides us all with the blueprint for how to react to mistakes, and it sets her up as a very impressive young woman with an extremely bright future. Structurally, this goes right down to Sheila's final line of the play, "I must think." Priestley has chosen her as his shining light, a fact emphasised by how often she's presented wearing white, for example. And so her final line effectively echoes through to the whole audience as the central premise of the whole play. We must think. Thanks very much for watching this Inspector Calls video. There will be more on the way if you require them. In the meantime, thanks for people who've been in touch already. Appreciate it very much. Please subscribe to this channel for more geeky English stuff. It's what Sheila Burling would want you to do. See you all next time. Take care. Bye-bye.